this moment, 149 years ago today, in Balham, South London, a place I used to live and know quite well, a man was taken ill with poisoning. He died 2 days later, and one of the most enduring mysteries of classic crime was born. Here is my best consideration of this and of what happened.
Charles Bravo had every reason to be satisfied with his life when he sat down to dinner with his wife and his wife's companion, Mrs. Cox, at 7:30 on the evening of the 18th of April, 1876. He was 30 years of age, a barrister in the city, and lived in one of the most prestigious homes in Balham, South London, with his beautiful and wealthy young wife, Florence, a widow whom he had married just 4 months previously. For his dinner he had lamb and potatoes, then a poached egg and spinach, and 3 or 4 glasses of Burgundy. A little time later, Mrs. Florence Bravo retired to her bedroom, which was next door to that of her husband, and fell asleep. Charles Bravo retired shortly after this, and at about 9:30 p.m. he rushed from his room, calling out to his wife, "Florence, hot water, hot water!" Apparently Mrs. Bravo did not wake up, and her companion, Mrs. Cox, who slept with Mrs. Bravo, came out in response to his calls. She found Charles in his room, very ill. He was violently sick and vomited out of the window. Mrs. Bravo was awakened by the maid, and in due course several doctors arrived, including Bravo's cousin, Dr. Royce Bell. Charles Bravo survived for 2 more days, until the early hours of Thursday, the 21st of April, 1876, when he died with his family gathered around him. His wife Florence, though only 30, was now twice widowed. Florence Bravo was born Florence Campbell in New South Wales, Australia, in 1845. The daughter of a wealthy speculator and gold trader, the family returned to Britain when she was 7 and lived at Buscott Park in Berkshire, also owning homes in London and Brighton. She was one of 8 children, and Florence lived the life of a young Victorian lady, travelling, improving herself, and practising the arts deemed suitable for a woman of her social caste. On a visit to Canada, she met Captain Alexander Ricardo, a British military officer in the Grenadier Guards, who was the only son of an MP and his wife, Lady Catherine, sister of the Earl of Fife. The young couple married at Buscott Park in 1864. Florence was just 19 years old, and her husband was 21. Ricardo was wealthy, and Florence received an annual allowance of £1,000. That's about £160,000 in 2025 on her own account from her father. The couple took up residence at Gatcombe Park in Gloucestershire, now the home of Princess Anne. But the marriage was not a happy one. Alexander was a drunk and a womanizer, and Florence was not a woman to put up with such conduct from her husband. She was, after all, not financially dependent on him, and in 1869, after less than 5 years' marriage, she informed her father she wished to divorce Captain Ricardo. Her father refused to hear of this. Instead, she and her husband were sent like penitent children to the spa town of Malvern in the west of England, in the hope of repairing their marriage. It didn't work, and soon afterwards she and Ricardo separated. She, and probably her husband, were treated by a doctor there called Dr. James Manby Gully. He was a fashionable doctor, a practitioner of homeopathic remedies and water treatments, much in vogue at the time, who had treated Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, and naturalist Charles Darwin. He had also treated members of Florence's family over the years, including Florence herself when she was young. She was now 25, and she became involved with the 62-year-old Dr. Gully. Gully was married, but separated at this time from his elderly wife, and he and his young, equally married but now separated mistress travelled widely together in England and Europe. Their relationship created a scandal, and Florence's family cut her off when they learned of it. It was fortuitous for her that her husband, Alexander Ricardo, who by now was living in Cologne in Germany with another woman, died soon afterwards from alcoholism. Florence, now a widow, inherited her late husband's fortune of £40,000, approximately £6 million in 2025. She was a very wealthy young woman. She could indulge herself without regard to anyone else, including her family. She employed a companion, a 48-year-old widow named Mrs. Jane Cannon Cox, who was from Jamaica and had returned to Britain with her 3 sons to see them settled. She became Florence's close confidant and something of a go-between in her affair with Dr. Gully. Florence was fascinated by Gully. He was a spiritualist, intelligent and innovative, and she and Dr. Gully lived first in Streatham, in neighbouring houses, and then in Balham, where Florence took the lease on the Priory, a substantial crenellated neo-Gothic house set in 8 acres of parkland. Gully lived nearby at Orwell Lodge in Bedford Road in Balham, and he had his own key to her house. There was a great deal of surreptitious commuting between their houses. The servants were aware of it, and so were the neighbours. By 1875 their affair had been going on for 5 years, attracting much scandal. Then, during the summer of 1875, Florence met Charles Bravo on a visit to Brighton with Mrs. Cox. It was not love at first sight for either of them. He was attracted to her for her money, and she sought the means of being restored to her estranged family and polite society, something which she could only do by relinquishing her elderly lover, Dr. Gully, and adopting a more conventional lifestyle. Thus, in the autumn of 1875, Dr. Gully found himself peremptorily dumped. He accepted her decision on the basis that she wished to reconnect with her family. She mentioned nothing of Charles Bravo to him at this time, though, and when Bravo suddenly appeared on the scene, and an engagement quickly followed, Gully was incensed. Charles Bravo was the same age as Florence, also born in 1875 as Charles Delaney Turner, but his father died when he was young, his mother remarried, and he took his stepfather's surname of Bravo. He was well educated, graduated from Oxford, and became a barrister. He was also fascinated by all things medical, attended surgical operations, and had many medical acquaintances. He made little money in the legal profession, and the allowance he received from his stepfather was modest. About £200 per year. That's about £30,000 in 2025. He had some other commitments too. He was involved with a woman in Maidenhead, with whom he had a daughter called Katie. His marriage to Florence Ricardo was, therefore, not merely a match, it was a sound business proposition. At the time of his death, he and Florence had been married for just 4.5 months. An inquest was held on the 25th of April 1875 at the Priory, following a post-mortem, at which Bravo's cause of death was given as poisoning by 30 to 40 grains of tartar emetic, antimony. Notable were the lies told by the principal protagonists at the inquest. Florence claimed her relationship with Dr. Gully was innocent. Mrs. Cox concurred. Gully hedged. But it quickly became abundantly clear that this was a lie. It had the effect of making the jury, the press, and public highly suspicious. The coroner for East Surrey, William Carter, went to extraordinary lengths to protect Mrs. Bravo. He did all he could to steer the jury towards a verdict that Bravo had taken his own life. But the jury was independent-minded, and it returned an open verdict in defiance of him. The press criticised Carter, castigated the principal witnesses, and questions were asked in Parliament. And as a result, the Attorney-General, Sir John Hooker, requested of the High Court that a new inquest into the death of Charles Bravo be called, and this was granted. It was held this time at the Bedford Hotel at Balham in July and August of 1876. Carter again officiated as coroner, but this time he had a legal assessor watching the matter with him. He now had little option but to allow a great deal of latitude to all manner of questions by those intent upon prying into every aspect of Florence Bravo's relationships and life. The public imagination was captivated by the death of a young man of 30 who had been married only 4 months to a woman who had lost one husband already, and had for 5 years been conducting a scandalous affair with a married man 37 years older than herself. The lurid details and the mysterious nature of Charles Bravo's death inspired a great deal of public speculation. Mrs. Cox's story changed to suit the occasion. No one doubted the rank mendacity of Florence Bravo and Dr. Gully, and a great deal was heard of the scandalous intrigue which had played out at the Priory in the months prior to Bravo's death. The medical men were in general agreement that the poison antimony must have been taken in Bravo's room after he retired at around 9:15 p.m., not during the dinner or in the wine taken earlier at around 7:30. Sir William Gull thought Bravo had taken poison and then lost his nerve and called for hot water to flush it out of his system. This was deemed unsatisfactory to the press and to Bravo's family, and the jury ran amok with questions and accusations, and at the end they returned a verdict of wilful murder by antimony poisoning administered by a person or persons unknown. This had the effect of pointing the finger at the widow, Florence Bravo. The police were obliged to act. A £250 reward, about £36,000 in 2025, was offered for information leading to the apprehension of the murderer. It was never collected. The police had little expectation that it would be. Scotland Yard's first head of CID, Superintendent Adolphus Williamson, and Chief Inspector Clark led the inquiry into the circumstances of Bravo's death. The facts of the case are known to us now largely by the 3 memoranda written by Chief Inspector Clark on the Scotland Yard file, dated the 11th of May, the 24th of May, and the 5th of June, 1876, and the press accounts of the 2 inquests. The principal facts are well known. After a short acquaintance and a shorter engagement, Bravo and Florence had married on the 7th of December, 1875. Dr. Gully, once surprised of the fact that he had not merely lost his young mistress to a wish on her part to reconcile with her family, but had been supplanted by a young suitor, was incensed. He met with Florence and urged her to delay the wedding to Bravo, but Florence wouldn't, and Gully furiously broke off all contact with Florence and instructed his servants not to admit her to his house. A few days prior to the wedding, Bravo had threatened to call it off when he learned he would not take possession of his wife's fortune. She intended to retain full control of her own finances. She made some concessions, transferring ownership of the furniture in the house to him, and her father gave him £500, approximately £75,000 in 2025, so that he didn't have to go to his wife for money. An uneasy reconciliation was effected, and the marriage went ahead. But the harmony didn't last. Charles Bravo resented his headstrong wife, his inability to control her or her drinking, and especially that she held the purse strings. The furniture in the house was his, but the servants, at least 14 of them, including Mrs. Cox, a coachman, groom, stable boy, several gardeners, maids, a cook, and butler, were in Florence's employment. Charles regarded this retinue to be an extravagance. They were also in his wife's control, and he tried to cut these back, but Florence was reluctant to make economies, and pointed out, quite reasonably, that it was her money, they were her servants. There were many rows between the newlyweds, and Charles was quick to temper, lost his self-control, and was given to bouts of sullen petulance. His ire was also extended to his wife's former lover, Dr. Gully. She had informed Charles of Gully prior to their marriage, and he had informed her of his illegitimate child by a woman at Maidenhead, and they had agreed that these things were in the past. But Bravo resurrected the matter of Gully. Gully lived close by, and Bravo constantly accused Florence of visiting him or corresponding with him. Florence tried to persuade Gully to move from the area in view of the irritation his proximity had become to her husband. But Gully refused. To make matters worse, in the weeks following their marriage, Bravo received 3 anonymous letters, which accused him of marrying Florence for her money, and referring to Florence as Dr. Gully's mistress. He was enraged by these, and believed Dr. Gully wrote the letters to sow discord. His jealousy became pathological, and the couple briefly split up. Florence later claimed Charles sometimes became violent towards her. It was also claimed by her that he had subjected her to some form of violent sexual assault. It is undeniable he could scarcely control himself when his temper was inflamed. In between such fits of anger, he grovelled, begged her forgiveness, and promised to improve. He really couldn't help himself. Dr. Gully met Jane Cox by accident on 2 occasions during this period, once at Balham train station, and once in the street. She accused him of writing the anonymous letters to Bravo, which he denied doing. When questioned about this subsequently at inquest, he said he could not recall this conversation between them. Meanwhile, Bravo continued to try to exert control over his wife. He asked Mrs. Cox to leave and return to Jamaica, but Mrs. Cox refused. Florence was emotionally dependent on her. She was a bulwark against her capriciously temperamental husband, too. The fact was, frustrating though it might be for Charles Bravo, she was employed by Florence, not by him. Having suffered a miscarriage in January of 1876, Florence Bravo suffered a second in early April. She was in poor health, and her drinking was getting worse. She shared a bedroom with Mrs. Cox, next door to her husband's, and decided to take a break on the south coast at the seaside town of Worthing in Sussex. Charles was not taken with the idea, and had his mother write to Florence, pressing her to curtail costs. Charles often seems to have employed this tactic. His father wrote to Mrs. Cox, trying to persuade her to remove herself from the household, and on another occasion he wrote to Florence regarding making economies in the stabling arrangements. It infuriated Florence to have her new in-laws interfere with her life, which she had long run for herself, and she criticized Charles's mother to him. He reacted badly. He flew into a temper and struck her. Things were coming to a head at the Priory in April 1876. On the 18th of April, Charles and Florence took the carriage to London. Charles was in restive mood. He was suffering with toothache. It started to rain. But when they passed Orwell Lodge, Gully's home, Charles became excited. He threatened Florence, ordered her to kiss him, and when she refused, he told the coachman to return home. Florence placated him, and they continued on their way to London. Here she went to a jeweller's and bought tobacco for her husband. Charles went to a Turkish bath in Jermyn Street, and then lunched with James Orr, his uncle, at St. James's Hall. In the afternoon, Florence returned in the carriage to Balham, and Charles took the train from Victoria later on. On arriving at the Priory, he decided to go for a ride. The groom warned him that the horses had already been exercised, but he brushed this aside. He was in no mood to be told by a groom what he could and could not do. He took out a cob, but the groom's warning proved sound. The horse bolted, taking him on an uncomfortable 4-mile ride, from which he returned stiff and sore. He then took a bath in his room. At dinner at 7:30 he was in a bad mood. The butler, Rowe, noticed this. Bravo complained he had received a letter from his father admonishing him for playing the stock market and losing money. It was the mildest of fatherly rebukes, but in his current mood it enraged Charles. After dinner, the three retired briefly to the morning room, where Charles instructed his wife to go to bed, as she was unwell, apparently still suffering from the effects of her miscarriage 12 days earlier. This was at around 8:30 p.m. She and Mrs. Cox said good night, and went upstairs to the room they shared. Soon afterwards, Charles went upstairs himself, and on the way he saw the servant, Mary Ann Keeber, bringing a bottle of wine to her mistress. She noted that Charles looked angry, and he went directly to his wife's room. Here he spoke to Florence in French, so that Keeber would not understand. But according to Cox, he said, "You have drunk a bottle of wine at dinner already, and now have ordered more." Florence did not reply, and Charles left the room. Then, at 9:30 p.m., Charles rushed from his room, calling for hot water. Keeber saw Charles on the landing, wearing his nightshirt, and fetched Mrs. Cox. Mrs. Cox went to his room and began to minister to Charles, rubbing his chest, and sending Keeber to fetch mustard and hot water. Charles vomited, and then seemed to faint. Mrs. Cox then sent for Dr. George Harrison at Streatham. Florence was awakened, and came to her husband, sending for another doctor, Dr. Joseph Moore, from Balham, who was closer. Dr. Moore arrived first, followed by Dr. Harrison. They asked Florence and Mrs. Cox if there was anything Charles might have taken to cause his illness. Florence suggested he had had a heart attack following his tumultuous ride, and Mrs. Cox suggested he might have drunk chloroform. But Dr. Harrison said he had taken something like arsenic, and inquired if there was any in the house. Florence said there was only rat poison in the stables. Dr. Royce Bell, Charles's cousin, was sent for. He came with Dr. George Johnson and another doctor, Henry Smith. Florence then telegraphed Bravo's mother and father to inform them of their son's illness, and requested them to come at once. The many doctors assembled at the Priory conferred, and agreed that Bravo was suffering from an irritant poison of some description, and he was asked what he had consumed. He said he had rubbed laudanum on his gums for toothache, and may have swallowed some of this inadvertently. On hearing this, Mrs. Cox took Bravo's cousin, Dr. Royce Bell, aside, and told him that when she had first visited him in his room, he had told her he had taken poison, but do not tell Florence. Royce Bell then insisted she tell the other doctors of this, so she did. When asked about this by Dr. Johnson, Bravo said he did not recall saying this. The only thing he had taken was laudanum. "That won't explain your symptoms," Johnson replied. Sir William Gull, the most eminent of London surgeons at this time, physician to Queen Victoria, called upon Bravo the following day at Florence's request, and examined him. The 6 medical men were quite clear. An irritant poison was responsible for Charles Bravo's condition. Gull spoke directly to Bravo. "What you took yourself?" he inquired. "Yes." "If you die without telling us more about it, someone may be accused of giving you the poison." "I am aware of that, but I can tell you nothing more," said Bravo. 3 times Sir William pressed him on this, and 3 times Bravo swore he had not taken poison knowingly. "So help me God," he added. It became clear to the doctors that Charles Bravo would die. A solicitor came, and he made a will, leaving everything to Florence. Florence offered to fetch a vicar for her husband, but he declined, and the family instead recited the Lord's Prayer with him. Charles Bravo died at 5:30 a.m. on the 21st of April, 1876. These are the salient facts as they are known in the Charles Bravo case, but what happened to him has remained a matter of speculation since. There are a limited number of possibilities for what occurred in the death of Charles Bravo. The first is that Florence Bravo poisoned him deliberately because she had plainly made the ghastliest error in marrying him, or that she did so accidentally or for some other purpose. The second is that Mrs. Cox poisoned him deliberately because her position was under threat from him, or that she did so accidentally or deliberately from the same motive as her mistress. The third is that Dr. Gully, Mrs. Bravo's former lover, killed his rival to clear the way for himself. In this he would need an accomplice, because he plainly could not enter, and had not entered the house for a considerable time. The fourth is that Charles Bravo took the poison himself, either deliberately or else took it by accident. And the fifth is that one of the servants present in the house at the time, or a former coachman called Griffiths, dismissed by Mrs. Bravo at her husband's behest, might have poisoned him. The easiest of these possibilities to dispose of is the final one. The servants stood to gain nothing from the murder of Bravo, and any grievance they might conceivably have had is completely eclipsed by the motives of those most immediately concerned with Bravo. The coachman, Griffiths, who had been heard to express a threat concerning Bravo in a pub, was not in the vicinity of Balham at the time of the poisoning, and had employment elsewhere. This leaves us with just 4 possible suspects: Charles Bravo himself, Florence his wife, Mrs. Cox, and Dr. Gully, or some combination of these. It is obvious that Dr. Gully, if involved, could not have acted alone, nor is there any evidence that he had been in contact with Florence, or could have been in contact with her for a sufficient length of time to establish the intimacy necessary for an enterprise like murder. Gully's involvement, in practical terms, would need to be in concert with Mrs. Cox, or with Mrs. Cox and Florence, a tripartite conspiracy. There are objections to Gully's involvement, however. His meetings with Mrs. Cox, fleeting and far from convivial, hardly recommend themselves to conspiracy to murder, and it is most improbable he would have been on such terms with Florence's companion to discuss a matter like murder. Gully had animosity towards Florence, but it seems to have softened. He felt wronged by her, certainly, but it is unlikely he would try either to assist her in murdering her husband, nor try to expose her to the suspicion of it. He may have been the author of the anonymous letters to Bravo, which inflamed the husband's jealousy of Gully further, but there is another possible author of these letters, which we will come to. What is the evidence against Florence? She lied repeatedly at the first inquest about her relations with Gully. The same is true of Mrs. Cox. And yet the lies told by the 2 women were ones told to conceal moral impropriety, not to conceal murder. It seems likely she regarded her marriage as a dreadful error. Well, it was, and it had no future. The 2 were locked in a terminal struggle which could only result in separation. But that did not mean she would kill her husband to extricate herself from the marriage. She went to extraordinary lengths to save him. She called in no less than 6 doctors, the best London and her wealth could afford, including Johnson and Sir William Gull, physician to Queen Victoria. In desperation, she sent Mrs. Cox to Dr. Gully, a man she was estranged from, but in whose practice she still had great faith, to try to save her husband. And Gully, it must be said, in spite of his determination to have no further contact with Florence, gave the best advice he could. And even that morning, after the row in the carriage between husband and wife, Florence had bought her husband tobacco in London, a peace offering. She was flailing around for a means of bringing him round, of putting the past firmly behind them. She was prepared to buy out Dr. Gully's lease on his house, to persuade him to move from the area, because she knew his proximity was a constant irritation to her husband. All the signs are that she was still trying to assuage her husband by all means possible, even though she must have known in her heart it was impossible. The marriage, just 4 months old, was stillborn. And there is nothing, as Chief Inspector Clark pointed out to Superintendent Williamson in his report, to connect Florence with antimony. She said in court that she had never even heard of it until her husband's death. There is nothing that contradicts this. There is nothing that indicates a desire to be rid of her husband either, nor with a wish to harm him. The same may be said of Mrs. Cox. Charles wished to remove her from his wife's employment. He was jealous of her closeness to his wife, jealous that she was a confidant in her relationship with Gully, witness to the improprieties of the past. But he failed to remove her, and there is nothing to suggest that Mrs. Cox, a 50-year-old mother of 3 sons, with expectations of property in Jamaica of her own, would jeopardize her future and her life by murdering Charles Bravo. After all, she it was who days earlier had rushed out into the night to implore Bravo to return to the house and his wife, when he had flounced out with characteristic petulance. She it was who rubbed Charles's chest and applied mustard poultice to counteract the poison she said he had told her he had taken. She acted on her mistress's behalf, not her own. She told Roy's Bell about his telling her he had taken poison. That she did not tell the first doctor on the scene, Dr. Moore, of this was greeted with incredulity by the inquest jury. But that is with hindsight, with a knowledge of the outcome. At the time Bravo had confided the matter to her, she was conscious of the effect on Florence, of the scandal such a matter would bring, and he had told her not to tell Florence. When Bravo became seriously ill, she realized she must inform someone, and so she told his cousin, Roy's Bell. It was the natural moment at which to breach the confidence. The question is, did Bravo say this to her at all? It is a crucial question, pivotal, because if he did, all other matters and suspicions fall away. The evidence points to him having done so. When questioned directly on the matter, he did not deny it. He simply said he did not recall doing so. It is the weakest possible denial. He showed no surprise at being told he was poisoned, no interest in who might have been responsible or how it had been administered. This was noted by Sir William Gull. It was noted by Detective Chief Inspector Clark, too. The coroner Carter also saw the importance of this. All of those directly involved in the events of that evening, and who saw Bravo in the hours following his being taken ill, were convinced that he had poisoned himself. The best he could do, when challenged on this insistently by the doctors, was to say he had taken laudanum, and may have inadvertently swallowed some. "That won't do. It will not offer an explanation for your symptoms," said Dr. Johnson sharply. To this he had no reply. It seems to be a matter of agreement that Bravo must have taken the antimony in his room at around 9:15, immediately following his retirement there. The only means found of taking the antimony were the water bottle and glass in his room. Could Bravo have drunk 30 to 40 grams of the heavy metal antimony suspended in water, as it must have been, without realizing it? Of course not. It would need to be disguised by being suspended in something thick and with flavor. If he had drank it in water, he would have spat it out reflexively, unless he drank it deliberately. From this, it seems clear that when Charles Bravo drank the antimony in the water, he knew he had taken poison. He knew it, and he drank it knowing it was there, because he had put it there himself. It will never be known what occurred in Balham in 1876 to a degree of accuracy, but there are some highly suggestive cues. Sir William Gull's suggestion that Bravo, in a fit of sudden despair, poisoned himself, electing for a long agonizing death, is incredible. So too is the notion that he may even have been poisoning his wife, contributing to her constant poor health, and accidentally poisoned himself. The use of antimony was an unlikely poison. The notion that Florence could have been dosing her husband with antimony to dampen his libido is equally improbable, because he could not have taken 30 to 40 grains of antimony in water without being aware of it. There is, in fact, an obvious reason why Charles Bravo had antimony in his possession and what its purpose was. Consider, Charles Bravo was fascinated by medicine, by all things medical. He attended surgical operations as a spectator. That is unusual. Perhaps it merely shows an inquisitive mind. But there are other cues. He self-medicated. He used laudanum on his gums. He used chloroform too. He took regular cold baths. He used Turkish baths for their medical benefits also. Why would Bravo have antimony? To return to first principles, consider the chief use of antimony potassium tartrate. It is a heavy metal, like arsenic and other poisons, but seldom used as a poison because the body rejects it forcibly. That is, in fact, its medicinal use, as an emetic, to make a person vomit. It was used as such from Roman times, up until as recently as 1970. In the medieval period, wine was left overnight or for a 24-hour period in a pewter vessel, and the effect of the acid in the wine on the pewter would be to leach enough of the tartar from the metal to make the wine an emetic. The Romans famously used it as a purgative for the purpose of eating and drinking to excess. In the 18th and 19th centuries, antimony was used to cure alcoholism. It was a very effective cure. Taken in conjunction with alcohol, it led to severe vomiting, a highly potent aversion therapy. It is evident that Bravo, who sought control of his wife, who nagged her constantly about her drinking, who that very evening had told her to go to bed, and chided her for drinking too much, and having himself retired, discovered the maid bringing her another bottle, was at his wit's end. Charles Bravo had a bee buzzing in his bonnet about his wife's drinking. It was principally an aspect of his control of her. He was making no headway over it either. Bravo, an amateur medical man who knew a great deal about medical science and its developments, had decided to treat his wife with the preeminent means of treating alcoholism in 1876, antimony. Inspector Clark points out repeatedly in his scrupulous reports in the matter that there is no evidence of where the poison came from, nor by whom it was administered. That is substantially true. Yet there is one alcoholic in the house, a woman who can down a bottle of wine at dinner, and then proceed to down another after it, who has been drinking during the day too. Doctors, her family, and others all acknowledged that Florence was a drunk. The reason she did not come to her husband when he shouted, in the words of Mary Ann Keeble, at the top of his voice, was that she was dead drunk. Mrs. Cox came to him. Florence made an appearance later. It seems to me that, taking in the circumstances of the couple, the character of Bravo, the alcoholism of Florence, and Bravo's obvious determination to do something about it, that he sought the most efficacious treatment available at that time, antimony. Where did he get it from? It was not difficult to come by in 1876. It still isn't. Purchasers were required to be entered in the poisons register, but such entries as the Bravo police files show were woefully lax. His own cousin, Royce Bell, was a doctor. He had many medical acquaintances, and antimony was not regulated so strictly as poisons like arsenic, because it was used as a remedy rather than a poison. It would typically result in the alarming symptoms of vomiting in the taker. It was a powerful emetic. Had he given it to his wife? We do not know. But if he hadn't, it was surely his intention of doing so. Florence had been ill for a while, but then she had recently had a miscarriage, which is sufficient reason for this. In what form he had it, we have no idea. No trace of it was found in the wine bottles, the glass or water bottle. Too much cleaning had gone on before these could be examined. If he had it in its typical medicinal form, then it would be in a folded paper of powder. The acting time of antimony is approximately 15 to 20 minutes. It was suggested that this might be extended by a full stomach, but the probability was, and is, accepted that Bravo took antimony at approximately 9:15 p.m. when he went to his room. But why did Bravo take the antimony himself? Bravo was a man with mental instabilities. He also had a certain misogyny about his character. He did not like his wife's independence or the fact that he depended on her wealth. He was jealous of her sexually, of her association with Gully, with anyone who shared with her that period she had been with Gully. Florence tried to bribe Gully to leave the area, but Gully refused. He was enthralled to her still. Why wouldn't he be? He was an old man, and she was a beautiful young woman in her 20s. She was his last fling. There would hardly be any others. Florence, for her part, was wilful. She must have known in her heart, whatever her dependence on Gully may have been, that he was not her long-term future. The mathematics of the relationship were simply wrong. Florence came into a fortune on her husband's death. She was already involved in a relationship with Dr. Gully by this time. It wouldn't last. How could it? Gully had children who were very much older than Florence. Her family were estranged from her as a result of this liaison. It was inevitable she would tire of it. She did. In 1875 she met Bravo. Superficially he was a good catch, handsome, of good family, well-educated, and a barrister. He was her get-out-of-jail-free card, and she played it. She dumped Gully, once secure of Bravo, and Gully accepted this. She told him she wished to reunite with her family, and he surely saw the sense of this. But he was less impressed when she became engaged to Charles Bravo. A very little investigation would reveal that there had been a degree of overlap between himself and Bravo. Florence had been less than candid in the reason she had given him for ending their relationship. Now Gully was furious. He had been misused, in his view. Whatever protestations of love that had passed between them had been continued only to the point of necessity and no further. As soon as she was secure of Bravo, she had relinquished him. So Gully did not behave with the equanimity expected of a gentleman. He was an old man who had squandered his final vital years on a woman who had simply moved on, cancelled all that had been between them. There is no fool like an old fool. He may well have written the letters to Bravo, anonymously, of course. Gully had no interest in seeing the course of true love run smooth. There is another possibility for the anonymous letters, though. It is that Bravo wrote these letters to himself. He was unstable enough to do it. It provided him with an excuse for resurrecting the taboo subject of Dr. Gully. In April, the tension between husband and wife was unbearable. Bravo was furiously intent on removing anyone with a link to Florence's past from their employment. He had been jealous and manipulative enough to present her with an ultimatum regarding her wealth and possessions just days prior to their marriage. The imminence of their wedding to this demand was calculated. She could hardly refuse him at this point without public humiliation. Her marriage was a mistake. There must have been occasions when she wished she had done herself a kindness by refusing his demand made just 8 days before their marriage. Because after the marriage things got worse. He sought by every means to exert his control over her and over every aspect of her life. He admonished her for drinking too much. He told her to go to bed when he wished it. He was petulant. He would demand a kiss from her when they were passing Gully's house as a proof of her love, and of his mastery of her, too. It was demeaning. When she refused, he told her if she did not kiss him as instructed, then she would know about it when they got home. He had beaten her, and sexually assaulted her in some manner too, it seems. His mother wrote to her, backing up her son's demands, that she relinquish the horses. It irritated her. "I can afford it," she retorted. She could. But such a riposte simply emphasized that differential between them. She had £3,000 per year. He had £200, 15 times his income. Her father gave him £500 so that he didn't need to ask her for handouts. It was generous, but this only served to increase his humiliation, impressed upon him the extent to which he was beholden to his wife. He had married her for her money, and yet he resented her for it. Sometimes he whipped himself into a fury, declared he would leave her. He should never have married her. His conduct during this period of his life in which we view him, those crucial months in which he came to know and marry Florence Ricardo, mark him out as excitable, unpredictable, quick to temper, and to apology afterwards. In fact, insanely jealous. So why would Bravo take the poison himself? It seems to me that Bravo took the poison as a means of wringing guilt from his wife and establishing the control over her he desperately sought. He had no intention of killing himself. He did tell Cox this because he realized he had taken poison, but he retracted this when questioned on it, because what could he say? How could he admit to Sir William Gull, to his parents, to all those assembled in the house, that he had taken poison in a fit of madness and frustration at his inability to control his wife? He told Gull he had not poisoned himself. Gull didn't believe him. He asked him 3 times, demanded that he tell him whether he had purposely taken the poison, and pointed out to him the dangers of his not doing so. But Bravo did not move on this. And yet, as Gull and others saw, Bravo showed not the slightest interest or curiosity as to where he might have taken the poison. He didn't query the food he had at dinner, nor the medicines he had, or water he had taken in his room. It was enough to persuade such people that he did not ask this, because he knew exactly where the poison had come from and how it was administered. He had done it himself. That day, the 18th of April, had been a litany of failures for Bravo. Taking the trap to London that morning, he had been thwarted by the weather, by his wife's refusal to oblige him with a kiss for Gully's benefit. He acted petulantly, ordered the carriage to return home, threatened her with violence, was soothed, relented, and they continued to London. He had lunch with his uncle. The Turkish baths in Jermyn Street followed. He returned to Balham via Victoria. He invited a friend he met in London to dinner, but was refused. It was another slight, the smallest possible one, but in the context of his day and his mood, it was another annoyance. At Balham he went for a ride. His horse bolted with him. He could not control this small cob any more than he could his wife. Had he not authority over his own horse even? It was his wife's horse, his wife's groom too. At dinner he spoke angrily of a letter he had received from his father concerning his playing the stock market and losing. Florence and Mrs. Cox drank. It irked him, not because she drank especially, but because she knew he disliked it. He forbade it. It probably fortified her to answer him back. The presence of Mrs. Cox and their intimacy was a reminder that he was not the master of his house. He must have felt like a lodger in the house, with the ghost of Dr. Cully ever lurking about. He sent his wife to her room after dinner, an act of authority. It was undermined because Mrs. Cox went with her. As he went to bed himself soon afterwards, very much out of sorts, he saw Keble on the stairs, heading for Florence's room with more wine. He was furious. He went to his wife's room. They had words. He had sent her to bed like an errant child, but she had ordered more wine. There was a party going on to which he wasn't invited. There was mounting frustration on his part. In his frustration and fury, which was knotting up unbearably within him, he went to his room, alone. He wished to cause alarm, upset in the house. How sorry she'd be. In a mood of furious indignation, on the verge of domestic insanity, he picked up the antimony, mixed it in the glass of water, and took it. Drank 30 to 40 grains of it. Antimony is a heavy metal. Its use as a poison is rare, because the body will reject it by convulsive, violent vomiting. Bravo counted on this. It would provide him with the most alarming symptoms of illness, with the mildest of outcomes. He would be fussed over and petted by the women. Their apologies and regret would swaddle him. He was mistaken. Antimony can sometimes be tolerated in sufficient quantity to do its damage before it can be purged. He didn't realize this immediately. He began to vomit out of the window. He called out to Florence. The maid heard him. Mrs. Cox came to him. At some point, Bravo became aware that his ingestion of the antimony had become critical, beyond what he might expect of its purgative effect. In fright, he told Mrs. Cox he had taken poison, but not to tell Florence. There is no reason to doubt Mrs. Cox on this point. She did indeed tell his cousin about it. She was discreet, and she only informed other doctors when Bravo's cousin insisted she do so. Bravo denied it, but in a very mild way. He didn't say, "What absolute nonsense! Why on earth would I take poison?" He said he didn't recall telling her that. It is wholly unconvincing. It didn't convince Gull or the others. The coroner Carter, for all his manifest defects, seems to have believed that Bravo had taken the poison deliberately. But the jury were not satisfied. Bravo's family were not satisfied, and ultimately, when the facts emerged of Florence's previous dalliance with Gully, the scandal of her first husband, her miscarriages, and the swirl of rumours that enveloped her, the press and the public became convinced there was foul play. There was a belief that Florence may, either alone or with Mrs. Cox's assistance, or with Gully and Cox's assistance, have murdered her husband. That was to be her tragic legacy. Dr. Gully remained at Orwell Lodge, Balham, his reputation indelibly marked by the scandal of his affair with Florence and the lurid details attending it. He died there 7 years later, in 1883. Mrs. Cox went to Lewisham in London and died in 1917 at the age of 91. After the inquest, Florence left London. She took refuge at Buscott Hall, a place where she had known happier days. But the happy days had now fled. She took a house at Southsea called Coombe Lodge, and here she lived with a housekeeper in isolation. She was a wealthy woman, but one morally and socially bankrupt. There would be no respite this time. Her drinking continued unabated. She was a drunk and had been for some time, and within 2 years of the death of her second husband, Charles Bravo, on the 17th of September, 1878, she had drunk herself to death. She was buried in West Norwood Cemetery, Lambeth, in an unmarked grave, the ceremony occurring at midnight on the 22nd of September, 1878, away from prying eyes. She was 33 years old.